There's a particular kind of silence that belongs only to empty rehearsal rooms, not the silence of a concert hall before the audience arrives, which carries anticipation inside it like a held breath, not the silence of a recording studio between takes, which is a working silence, purposeful and temporary. The silence of an empty rehearsal room is different. It is the silence of a space that exists specifically for sound and has been denied it. It sits in the air like an unanswered question. And on a morning in early 2018, that silence was the only thing filling a rehearsal room in Vancouver where Michael Bublé stood at a microphone and could not sing. He had been standing there for 2 hours. His band was outside in the corridor, not dismissed, not told to leave, simply understanding, in the way that people who have worked closely with someone for years develop an understanding of what that person needs without being told. They were waiting. Some of them sat on equipment cases. Some of them had coffee. One of them, the drummer, had his phone out but was not looking at it. They were all waiting for a sound from inside the room that had not come. The world knew what had happened in the 2 years before this morning. In 2016, Michael Bublé's son Noah had been diagnosed with liver cancer at the age of 3. Michael had withdrawn from everything: the tour, the recordings, the appearances, the entire architecture of a career that had been built across more than a decade of sustained and exceptional work, and had gone home to be with his family. The industry had understood, the fans had understood, the press had largely been kind. Nobody had demanded his return. Nobody had said. Timeline: the silence of his absence had been received with the respect that it deserved. Noah had recovered. The treatment had worked with the particular completeness that felt, to anyone who had followed the family's ordeal, with the helpless attention of people who cared about strangers in crisis, like something more than medicine, like the world correcting a mistake it should never have made. By late 2017, Noah was healthy. The family was intact. The crisis had passed into something that would always be part of them without defining them the way it had defined the years it occupied. And Michael Bublé was standing at a microphone in an empty rehearsal room in Vancouver, 2 hours into a morning that was supposed to be the first day back, unable to make a sound. To understand the silence in that rehearsal room, it helps to understand what the 2 years had contained, not the public version which had been reported with care and sensitivity. The interior version, what it is to be a person who has spent his entire adult life walking toward stages, toward microphones, toward the specific act of opening his mouth and producing sound for other people, and to have that entire trajectory interrupted by something that made the trajectory feel, in its most honest moments, entirely beside the point. Michael Bublé had always understood his career in relation to other people. The music was never, for him, primarily a form of self-expression in the way that some artists described their work. It was communication, a form of reaching toward other people, of making them feel something they needed to feel, of being present for the moments in their lives that required a certain kind of sound in the background. He had said versions of this in many interviews, in many different phrasings, always returning to the same essential understanding. The music was for the people receiving it, not for the person making it. The 2 years with Noah had not changed this understanding. They had deepened it in ways that would take years to fully articulate. Because what the 2 years had contained, alongside the terror and the hope and the exhaustion of watching a child fight a disease that had no business being inside a 3-year-old body, was also something else. A quality of presence, enforced, complete, undeniable, that the career had never quite produced. He had been for 2 years entirely in one place with one purpose, for one reason. He had not performed, he had not charmed. He had not made anyone feel good through the careful construction of a 2-hour experience. He had simply been a father present with his son in the most undecorated form that being a father allows. Coming back to the microphone meant leaving that form of presence for the other one, the career form, the constructed, careful 2-hour form. And standing in that rehearsal room on a morning in early 2018, the two forms of himself felt further apart than they ever had, not in opposition, exactly, but separated by a distance that 2 years of the most important thing he had ever done had opened between them. The band waited in the corridor. The room was silent. And in the corner of the rehearsal room, a 24-year-old technical assistant named James Hartley sat with a clipboard on his knees, trying to make himself as small as possible, and understood that he was witnessing something he had no framework for. James Hartley had been hired 3 weeks earlier as a junior technical assistant for the Return Tours production team. He was 24 years old, recently graduated from a technical production program, and had been offered the position through a contact his program director had in Michael Bublé's management organization. He had grown up in a small town in Ontario, the son of a contractor and a school librarian, and had come to production work through the combination of a practical aptitude for equipment and a love of live music that had never resolved itself into any desire to perform, but had instead found its expression in the infrastructure that made performance possible. He had been assigned to the rehearsal room that morning to manage the technical setup, the monitors, the microphone positioning, the level checks. He had completed these tasks before Michael arrived and had then taken a seat in the corner with his clipboard, preparing to make adjustments as the rehearsal progressed. He was not, by temperament or by professional training, someone who spoke without being spoken to in professional situations. He understood the hierarchy of a touring production and his position within it, and that position did not include offering unsolicited commentary to the artist at the center of the enterprise. He sat in the corner for 2 hours while Michael Bublé stood at the microphone and said nothing. He watched the microphone stand. He watched Michael's hands. He watched the specific quality of the stillness in the room, which was not the stillness of someone gathering themselves, but the stillness of someone who has arrived at a point they cannot move past and does not yet know how to proceed. At the 2-hour mark, he did something that he could not have entirely explained if someone had asked him immediately afterward. He set his clipboard down on the floor beside his chair. He stood up, and he walked across the rehearsal room to where Michael Bublé was standing at the microphone, and he said something. What James Hartley said to Michael Bublé in that rehearsal room is not a long story. It is, in fact, a very short one. But the length of what is said and the weight of what it carries have never been reliably correlated, and what James said in that moment carried more than most things said at much greater length. He said, "I watched a video of one of your shows once, a long time ago. My mum was sick, not the same as what you went through, but sick in a way that made everything feel very small and very far away. And someone sent me a clip of you singing. I don't even remember which song, but I remember that it made me feel like the world still had something good in it." He paused. He said, "I just thought you should know that, because you're standing there like you've forgotten why any of this matters, and I don't think you have. I think you're just scared." He stopped. He had said what he had to say. He did not elaborate or qualify or walk it back. He simply stood there and waited. Michael Bublé looked at him for a long moment. James Hartley, 24 years old, junior technical assistant, 3 weeks into his first major touring job, standing in the middle of a rehearsal room with no authority to say anything and the specific courage of someone who has decided that the cost of staying silent is higher than the cost of speaking. Michael said, "What was the song?" James thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I think it was Haven't Met You Yet." Michael was quiet. Then he said, "That's a good one." James said, "Yeah." There was a silence between them that was different from the silence that had preceded it, shorter, lighter, the silence of two people who have said something true to each other and are giving it a moment to settle before the next thing happens. Then Michael turned back to the microphone. He adjusted the stand slightly, the small, habitual, professional gesture of a performer locating himself in relation to the equipment. He looked at the back wall of the rehearsal room for a moment. Then he opened his mouth and sang the first line of a song that the band in the corridor could hear through the door, and one of them, the drummer, set down his phone and closed his eyes and let out a breath he had apparently been holding for some time. The return tour was announced in the weeks that followed that rehearsal. The music industry received the announcement with the particular warmth that it reserves for comebacks that feel earned rather than manufactured, the warmth of an audience that has been waiting and is genuinely glad the wait is over. Tickets sold quickly. The venues were large. The expectations were correspondingly high, carrying the additional freight of everything that had happened in the 2 years of absence. Michael prepared with the thoroughness that had always characterized his approach to performance. The set lists were reviewed. The arrangements were refined. The technical specifications were coordinated with venue after venue across the tour's itinerary. He rehearsed daily with the band in rooms that were now filled with sound rather than silence. The quality of the rehearsals, by the account of those present, was different from what had preceded the 2-year gap. more focused in some ways, more patient in others, as though the time away had clarified something about what the work was for that had been present before but less precisely defined. James Hartley was on the production team for the full tour. He did not discuss what had happened in the rehearsal room with anyone on the crew. It was not in his assessment a story about him, and stories that are not about you are not yours to tell. He did his job, managed the technical requirements of each venue, and watched from the wings as the tour unfolded across cities and countries, and the particular geography of a career resuming after an interruption that had reshaped the person at its center. Michael performed each show with something that the people who had seen him perform before the two-year gap found difficult to precisely articulate but consistently noticed. A quality of weight, not heaviness, not sorrow, but the specific gravity that belongs to someone who has been somewhere important and brought something back from it. The warmth was still there, the charm was intact. The voice was, if anything, more controlled than it had been, carrying its emotion with a steadiness that suggested not restraint, but the particular kind of mastery that only arrives on the other side of having lost and recovered something essential. The audiences felt it without being able to name it. They called it presence, they called it depth, they said things like, "He seemed more real this time." What they were responding to was the accumulated weight of what the 2 years had cost him and what they had given back. A knowledge of what mattered settled into the voice with the permanence of something that had been learned the only way important things are learned. Michael spoke about Noah in interviews with a careful restraint that those who understood his character recognized as love rather than evasion. He did not offer Noah's story to the public as a narrative of triumph or a proof of anything. He spoke about the experience with the directness of someone who has been through something that has no clean edges and has decided not to impose clean edges on it in order to make it more comfortable for other people to receive. What he said, in various forms across various interviews in the period following the return, was that the 2 years had given him something he had not known he was missing. Not perspective in the vague, general sense that the word usually carries. Something more specific, a knowledge of what the music was actually for, arrived at through the particular process of having been separated from it completely and understanding from that distance what it had been doing all along. He said, "I always knew the music was for the people receiving it, but I think I understood it abstractly. I understood it as a professional conviction rather than a lived one. Being away, being somewhere that had nothing to do with performance, where the only thing that mattered was one small person's health, gave me an understanding of what it means to need something that makes the world feel less frightening. Music had done that for people. It had done it in rooms I had been in. I had watched it happen and I had been glad, but I had not fully felt from the inside what it was to be someone on the receiving end who desperately needed exactly that." Noah's recovery had given Michael Bublé back his son. It had also given him, as a secondary gift that arrived quietly and without announcement, a deeper understanding of his own work than he had possessed before the crisis took everything away and then, astonishingly, returned it. He carried all of this on to every stage of the return tour, not as a public statement, not as a narrative he offered the audience, but as the invisible foundation beneath every performance, the weight that the audiences felt without naming, the thing that made the voice sound like it was coming from somewhere that had recently been tested and had held. James Hartley completed the return tour and moved on to subsequent productions within the industry. He was, by his own account, a different kind of production professional after that tour than he had been before it, not because anything dramatic had happened to him, but because he had been present for something that had quietly reorganized his understanding of what the work was for. He had grown up understanding live music as a technical enterprise. He understood microphone positioning and monitor levels and the logistics of moving a production from one venue to another with the precision that the schedule demanded. This understanding was real and useful, and he was genuinely good at it. But the rehearsal room morning had added a layer to it that the technical training had not provided, an understanding of what all the equipment and logistics were ultimately in service of, which was a human being opening their mouth and making a sound that other human beings needed to receive. He called his mother that evening from a hotel room in a city he still remembers clearly. He told her he had had an unusual day. She Asked what had happened, he told her in broad terms without specifics or names a story about a performer who had forgotten why it mattered and had needed to be reminded. His mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That happens to everyone, the forgetting. The question is whether someone is there to remind you." James said someone was there. His mother said, "That was you, wasn't it?" He said, "I just said a thing." She said, "That's usually all it takes." He has not spoken publicly about what happened in that rehearsal room. He is not a person who seeks recognition for things that were not primarily about him. What he carries from that morning is something private, the knowledge that he walked across a room when everything in him said to stay seated, and that walking across the room mattered, and that the distance between where he was sitting and where Michael was standing was shorter than it looked and longer than it felt, and exactly the right length for what needed to happen. In the years since the return tour, Michael Bublé has continued to perform and record with a consistency that suggests the 2-year interruption was not a pause in the career, but a transformation of it. The albums released after the return carried a quality that reviewers noted and fans felt, something in the interpretive depth of the vocal performances, a willingness to let the emotion in a lyric arrive at its own pace rather than being guided there, the specific patience of someone who has recently understood what it means to wait for something important. He spoke about music differently in the interviews that followed, not in ways that the casual listener would necessarily notice, but in ways that the people who had been paying attention to how he had always spoken about it could recognize as a shift. The professional convictions were the same. The love of the songs, the respect for the tradition, the commitment to the audience's experience, all of that was intact as it had always been. But underneath those convictions was a new layer, arrived at through the only method available for learning things that cannot be taught, living through something that stripped everything else away and revealed what remained. What remained for Michael Bublé was the music, not as a career or a product or a reputation, but as the thing he did that made the world feel less frightening for the people in the rooms where he did it. That understanding had always been there in some form. The 2 years with Noah had burned away everything that was not essential to it and left it standing alone in the open, visible, and unambiguous, impossible to lose again because it had already been lost once and recovered at a cost that clarified its value permanently. On the morning in that Vancouver rehearsal room, after James Hartley said what he said and returned to his corner, after Michael adjusted the microphone stand and looked at the back wall for a moment and opened his mouth, the first note was not spectacular. It was not the kind of opening that announces a triumphant return. It was quiet, slightly tentative, the sound of a voice reacquainting itself with the act of singing after 2 years of near silence on that particular frequency. But it was a note. It was sound where there had been silence. It was the beginning of the thing that the band in the corridor had been waiting for, that James Hartley had crossed the room to help make possible, that Noah's recovery had made imaginable after a period in which imagining anything beyond the immediate had felt like a luxury the family could not afford. The band heard it through the door and came back into the room without being asked. They picked up their instruments without discussion. The rehearsal began with the quiet efficiency of professionals who have been doing something together for long enough to know when to talk and when to simply play. Michael sang through the first song and then the second and then the third, and with each one the voice found more of itself, the warmth returning, the control reasserting itself, the specific quality of presence that had always characterized his best performances arriving again, as though it had merely been waiting somewhere nearby for the right moment to come back. James Hartley sat in his corner with his clipboard and made the adjustments that the technical requirements demanded and did not look up more than he needed to. He had done what he had come to do. The rest of it, the tour, the performances, the 2 hours of warmth delivered to arenas full of people who had been waiting, belonged to Michael. It had always belonged to Michael. James had only reminded him that it was still there, waiting where he had left it, undiminished by the 2 years that had passed, ready to be picked up again the moment he was ready to carry it. The first rehearsal ended in the early afternoon. Michael thanked the band. He thanked James briefly and directly, the way he thanked people, without excess, without performance, simply acknowledging that something had mattered. James nodded. Michael picked up his jacket and left. The room returned to the particular silence of a space that has recently held music and is now holding its memory. A different silence from the one that had preceded the rehearsal. Warmer, resolved. The silence of something finished rather than something stuck. That evening, in a city that had been waiting 2 years for him to come back, Michael Bublé sat at a table with his family and told Luisana about the rehearsal. He described the 2 hours of silence. He described James walking across the room. He said, "A 24-year-old kid told me I was just scared, and he was right." Luisana looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Were you?" He thought about it. Then he said, "Yes, but I sang anyway." She said, "That's the only definition of courage that I've ever found useful." He looked at her. He said, "That's a good one." She said, "I know."